My mental health issues, they started like overnight. Something that happens with me with a lot of stress and anxiety is I get sick a lot. So I got a bunch of cases of strep throat and tonsillitis. And then I went on the antibiotic amoxicillin to treat the strep throat. And then I had an anaphylactic reaction. Just from that day on, I was afraid to leave the house. I was afraid to sleep. I was afraid to eat. I couldn't even take a shower because I was afraid that I was allergic to the water.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Please Excuse My OCD. My name is Tyler, and I'm here with my friend Jacqueline, who has the anxiety community on Instagram.
Hi,
She
everyone.
is, there she is. Yeah, I love how you have the microphone too. Like it's perfect. We both have microphones. We're
Took
both
me
in
a
the
while to set up.
podcast.
Yeah.
But I'm so excited to have you here, Jacqueline, and to talk about your story with anxiety and OCD, and also the fact that you're in school and you're studying psychology to be a psychotherapist. I think that's incredible, and I can't wait to hear about it. So, as always, right now, I know we're both not therapists at the moment, but
Mhm.
as always, if you are struggling with anything, OCD, anxiety, any of that, please seek professional help from a provider who can help you. So, with that being said, Jacqueline, I'm so excited to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. That's about it. Thank you. Yeah, I'm in
So,
school. I'm in my undergrad right now studying for psychology. So there's a few years left before I'm a psychotherapist, but I am really excited to do that. At first, I wanted to be a nurse, but I started that anxiety community on Instagram years ago, and I just kept coming back to helping people with mental health. And I was like, maybe it just makes sense to go to school for it.
I think that's so cool. So, walk me through that a little bit. But so you started the anxiety community on Instagram. Obviously, there was a pull there from like your own personal experience, right?
Yes. So
Okay.
I got diagnosed with OCD when I was about 16 years old. And a lot of the topics that I went through, like the themes of OCD, were very taboo. I went through like the fear of schizophrenia OCD, pedophilia OCD, big health anxieties, like most of it just revolved around health. And it got to the point where nobody around me had OCD in my life. A lot of people had anxiety, but I don't know. I couldn't really open up to it with my friends because they didn't understand. And if I started talking about a lot of the taboo topics with OCD, they'd look at me like, maybe there's something wrong with you. And then my anxieties were, maybe there is something wrong with me because that was part of my OCD. Like maybe this is an OCD, maybe this is schizophrenia, for example. So
Mhm.
I wanted to create a community where people could just say anything and then be able to meet people, not so much for the reassurance, but just reassurance that you're not alone in it.
I love that. I'm just taking that in because I feel like, especially with the taboo topics, there's such a misunderstanding, even within the mental health community of people like providers, right?
Yes.
To be really specialized in OCD is so important, I think, to the person seeking help,
Mm-hmm.
that they seek people who are specialized in OCD. Because if you go to, for instance, like I totally understand you on those topics. Mine was more at the time like harm and contamination.
Me too.
Like
Yep.
if yeah, like going up
All
to
of
a
them.
doctor, yeah, like they really all do bleed into each other. I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of us have gone, like, I don't know if you've ever thought this, but like there was one point where I was like, I've thought of literally everything you can ever think of and being
Yeah.
terrified of that.
Yeah. Like,
you know
absolutely.
but it's scary for somebody with OCD to like go to a doctor and be like, hey, I'm having these thoughts of like hurting myself and other people I love, like why am I having, and not
Yeah.
know that that's part of anxiety or OCD.
When my OCD started, before it was diagnosed, even as a child, it was completely all just health themes. Am I going to have Parkinson's? Am I going to have a heart attack? Am I going to have an allergic reaction? And once I got to the point in my recovery where I was kind of seeing the patterns of how my brain worked, it completely took a switch. And then my OCD was like, what's wrong with you that you're thinking that? And that's when I started thinking, are you having psychosis? Are you having like schizophrenia? And so I spiraled and spiraled with that. And then I went to the ER because in Canada, I don't know what it's like in the States, but there's very long wait lists for things. So
Mhm.
I went to the ER to see the on-call psychiatrist because it would have been probably like a year and a half before I could
Wow.
C1 waitlist time. So I went there and I was just asking them, I was like, am I manic? Am I this? Just throwing a bunch of labels that I didn't even understand what it was at them. And they were like, well, do you ever have like weird thoughts? And I was so scared of getting a diagnosis that I didn't want to tell them that. Like, and the questions they ask you are to screen for, those
Right.
disorders. So they're like, well, do you ever have thoughts of hurting people? And I didn't want to say yes because in my head, I'm like, that means they're going to diagnose me with this, even
Right.
though it's OCD and I don't want to because it's completely
Mhm.
the opposite of what you want,
Yeah.
right? So I was afraid
That's
to open up to them a lot.
of course. And I feel like that's a very for someone who's experienced OCD
Hmm.
in that way, like that is a very scary, vulnerable thing because you know that you don't want that, but you're like, why can't I stop thinking about this? Like, why am I
Yeah.
so afraid of myself?
Hmm.
And so you said you got diagnosed at 16, right?
Yeah.
So
Between like 16 and 18, I don't remember when I was exactly diagnosed, but my
mhm.
OCD, like for sure, like started at 16.
Okay. And you said that that was like harm OCD and contamination at that time?
It started with a lot of health anxieties.
Yeah.
I would say contamination went into that a lot because I was afraid of allergies. And so I was afraid of, like, I was washing all of my dishes and stuff, but not because I was afraid of like germs. I was afraid of
Mhm.
contamination, that like if somebody cooked an
Gotcha.
egg in a pan, I I would buy a whole new pan. Like I just couldn't.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I
Totally
had
understand.
contamination in that sense.
Okay. And so that was like, is this like around the age that you start to notice this, or did this happen like the
Well,
noticing of
no,
it?
my mental health issues, they started like overnight. So
Wow.
as a child, I was always really anxious, but it's hard to tell the difference between just an anxious child and then a child that like has an actual mental health disorder, right?
Hmm.
So I was anxious as a kid, but then when I was 16, I went on birth control. And
Hmm.
before that, I was happy, like I was completely fine. I was in my element. But then 2 months into the birth control, I started getting really depressed and I was having like mood swings. And then because I started getting really anxious and depressed from that, my doctor ended up taking me off of that. But my immune system, something that happens with me with a lot of stress and anxiety, is I get sick a lot. So I
Hmm.
got a bunch of cases of strep throat and tonsillitis. And then I went on the antibiotic amoxicillin to treat the strep throat. And then I had an anaphylactic reaction to that. And to treat me for that reaction, I was on like a bunch of different steroids, like the hives weren't going away. All of those medications induced my anxiety. And then just from that day on, it was like 2 months prior, it was at like a 4. And then it was at like
Oh,
a 20 out of 10 for probably 3 years straight. Like it was like overnight
wow.
for me.
That's just wild to hear.
Yeah.
And because I know when that light almost like flicks and
Yeah.
you're in, it's almost like your brain's in a different zone, like different
Yeah.
reality,
You're all of a
you
sudden not
know?
safe with yourself or anywhere.
Right. And so
Yeah.
that those years of not even knowing what's up or down,
Hmm.
what did you do? Did you tell anybody about it? Was there any form of like,
I
hey, I need
couldn't
help?
do anything. I was afraid to leave the house. I was afraid to sleep. I was afraid to eat because like it was like the most severe you could have health anxiety. Like I couldn't even take a shower because I was afraid that I was allergic to the water. Like that's why I started
Mm-hmm.
questioning, am I having psychosis or not? And I wasn't. It was just OCD. But
Mm-hmm.
like when I would take a shower, I have some circulation issues, so I would get hives from the hot water. Immediately I would have a panic attack anytime I'd step foot in the shower. So I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't leave the house. I stopped going to school and I took a leave of absence from work. So what I didn't do
Wow.
anything. Yeah. So
Wow.
I had a good friend group when I was in grade 10, I think, and then in grade 11, I just like completely lost all my friends and then it was just me and my boyfriend at the time and my parents.
Wow.
Yeah.
Extremely isolating.
Yeah, and it just felt like it was overnight too. I know some people kind of
Yeah.
have it gradually, but it was just pretty much overnight after that allergic reaction for me.
So you remember that really like vividly, the reaction, and then
Yeah, but
your
it's
life
strange
changing.
because I wasn't anxious about the allergic reaction. That's just when the exact like because OCD is a little like illogical, right? So it's like
Yeah.
sometimes you can worry about one thing, but be completely fine with something else that's like a natural risk. So I wasn't worried about the allergic reaction at all. But after that allergic reaction, which was to medication,
Mm-hmm.
um, I convinced myself maybe I shouldn't have peanuts today because I'm just going to wait till my body's a little less sensitive to start that. And now looking back, I'm like so mad at myself because like I know how OCD works, where like if I just ate that stuff right away, I wouldn't have had the issues. But
Mm-hmm.
like 5 years later, I still wasn't eating those foods.
Wow. Okay,
Hmm.
so that's heavy.
Yeah.
What was the like for you? What was the catalyst, like the changing moment where I was like, I need help. Like how do I get help?
I always knew that I needed help. Um, I thought it was over for me. Like I was extremely, it's so weird because I had so much health anxiety about dying and like things happening, but a trigger warning just for people
Mhm.
who need it for talking about suicide and stuff. But I was so extremely suicidal at the same time. So it was weird for me because I don't think that I wanted to die. I think I was just so stuck that I just didn't want, I just wanted to be out of the situation.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to have almost like two different people kind of inside of your head
Hmm.
between the harm OCD, like in the suicidality, and also being suicidal at the same time, I feel like,
It was confusing for sure because like my
yeah.
biggest fears, my OCD was revolving around bad things happening and death. At the same time, like I'd be crying on the bathroom floor and my mom would be on the other side of the door talking to me about talking me out of like hurting myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wow.
Feeling a lot of things at once. Yeah.
Yeah, which is something that I think isn't talked about enough, is the fact that you can have multiple feelings about something
Yes.
at
Yeah.
the same time.
Hmm.
So, okay, so at this point, you know, getting the help that you need to, and realizing that you have something to share, the
Oh,
voice
yes, that was the
of.
problems. I started going to therapy a couple months later.
Mhm,
Um, I didn't really know a lot about therapy. Like I know maybe a 5 year gap. It isn't that much, but I feel like 5 years ago compared to now, a lot of people are going to therapy now and talking about it openly. And it was still open compared to 20 years ago, 5 years ago, but none of my
mhm,
friends or anybody were talking about going to therapy. So I saw a psychotherapist. Everybody in my life said it was a waste of money, but I went because I think we had insurance for like 5 appointments or whatever. And she goes, "What do you want out of this?" And I said, "I just want to be able to eat normally again because my allergy fears were so extreme that I'd have a panic attack even if I drank water." So I had like
mhm.
two or three EpiPens with me. Um, and I'd have a panic attack anytime I ate. And so there was only like a couple ingredients that I was comfortable with. I was eating like ground beef, like the specific like kinds of like cheese and stuff like that. So I went there initially just wanting to be able to eat normally again. And this was before I even knew I had OCD. And then I just never left. Like, I loved my therapist. So, like, I still see her occasionally, like once every couple months. But that's when I was just like, maybe this OCD is like so high because there's so many other anxiety issues in my life.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me the difference between, or for the viewers, the difference between a psychotherapist and like just a regular therapist?
I don't know the specific answer to that, but
Hmm.
with OCD, there's definitely a difference between an OCD specialist and a psychotherapist because when I first started, I was doing talk therapy instead of like the ERP therapy. And it was actually doing me more harm than good because with my health anxieties, a lot of my obsessions and compulsions, so they were mental, they weren't as physical as some people's are. So I'd have a lot of rumination and
Hmm.
avoidance and things like that. So doing talk therapy was just contributing to me spiraling about
Right.
those things. Um, so it wasn't until I started doing CBT helped, but ERP and kind of like a combination of that is what helped me the most because then I could understand why I was thinking this way and then I could do the exposures because the OCD with anything didn't get better until I started exposing myself to things and being like, "Oh, maybe my OCD is lying to me." Like maybe
Hmm.
because at first you trust it and
Of
then after a
course.
while you understand how it works.
So can you tell me a little bit about your experience with ERP? Because like I know there's such a big debate with
Yeah.
ERP and like ICBT and like the different communities that that brings.
Yeah.
And
I know
we
there's
know
a lot of
ERP
debate between
works.
everything, but just sorry for interrupting. I think
No,
whatever
sure.
works for you, and honestly, a combination of all things sometimes. I don't think
Yeah.
it's just one thing is better than the other. I think it
Hmm.
also depends on the person, right? So for
Yeah.
me, starting with CBT helped a lot because it really taught me about my thought patterns and challenging my health anxiety. I always had these thought records that I would fill out in therapy. And then I'd have these questions in those. So you'd start with, like, what's the fear, basically? You'd write it down. And then you'd have challenging questions. So you'd be like, have I had this thought before? And then you'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I've had this thought before. And then this is where you're kind of rewiring the brain. You'd be like, well, what makes this thought different from the last thought? So you're trying to separate what's a real fear from like what your anxiety is making up, basically. So if I was afraid that I had Parkinson's, for example, then I would be asking myself, so just identify, I'm sorry if this sounded confusing, but just
No.
identifying the patterns of everything. So I'd ask myself, how is this thought that I'm gonna have Parkinson's different than the last thought? Have you had thoughts like this before? And then I'd write on the paper, yeah, I had thoughts of going blind. I had thoughts of this. And then you want to point out, did those things happen? No, they didn't happen. So what makes this different? So it's just sometimes logic doesn't work for anxiety, but when you do it in a specific way, it really does help ground you and understand the anxiety is separate from who you are, and it's also separate from reality a little bit.
Hmm. And going down to the belief system, right? And
Yeah.
how your belief systems are structured a certain way, it doesn't mean that they are true in reality. And also, I went to the OCD con a few weeks ago,
Yeah.
and there was a really good panel about how a lot of it goes down to the root of I won't be able to handle that if this happens.
Yes. Yeah. Doubt and underestimating your coping abilities for sure.
That
Yeah.
and that was like a thing in my brain for some reason, where it really does come down to a lot of like that self-confidence and the
Mm-hmm.
ability to look inward a bit like that. So for your journey through ERP, did you feel well, how long was that journey for you? Like from, are you still in ERP or?
My therapist wasn't really an OCD specialist, so a lot of these
Mhm.
things I actually learned like from the online community, the same people that you follow and that.
Yes.
So I can't really pinpoint exact, like it's not like I did like a 6 week program or anything. It was just so
Gotcha.
continuous over like a 5 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is like you saying, I need to do this and
Hmm.
kind of get this a grip on this, and I'm going to do it daily.
Yeah. If I were to go back knowing how OCD works, I would definitely look for an OCD specialist. I would definitely look for
Hmm.
one that specializes in the response prevention, things like that.
Hmm.
And I would do a more structured thing because I just feel like doing it all close together.
Yep.
I don't know what I'm trying to say. I just feel like it's more beneficial than like I would go to therapy one time and be like, well, I'm afraid that I have Parkinson's. And then sometimes the talk therapy would, not be good. And then the next session,
Yeah.
she'd be like, well, are you eating yet? And I'd be like, well, no. And she'd be like, okay, we're going to set it as a goal for you to eat this by the next appointment. So, like, some of it was good, some of it wasn't. And I think it definitely prolonged my recovery a lot.
Yeah.
Um, but OCD wasn't as well known when I first got it, like the mental side of it, I think.
Hmm.
So, I would
Well,
definitely go to an OCD specialist if I were to do it all over again.
yeah, I love that because I had the same experience too with being just in talk therapy and then
Mm-hmm.
nothing else. And then I tried to expose myself to my fears without a specialist, and that made things worse for me because I didn't have the response prevention part of it. It was
Yes.
just like
Yeah.
me like torturing myself basically.
Mm-hmm.
So I 1000%, I'm happy that you brought that up about actually working with somebody throughout the process. So, which is incredible. And I'm also glad that you brought up the OCD or like the online community because I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I don't know, it sounds like it's been the same for you, but it sounds like you learned a lot about yourself through seeing other people talk about it
Yeah.
and post about it, right?
Yeah, when before I was diagnosed with OCD, and a lot of the things I was going through, like a extreme fear of schizophrenia, for example, I thought nobody else in the world had that. And so I was terrified to open up about it because I thought nobody had it. And then I followed all these therapists, and every single one of them talked about it because it's such a common theme with it. So it's like
Hmm.
once I got that diagnosis, it was really validating seeing them talk about it because all of a sudden I was like, there's people actually have this, but I didn't want to look it up because I felt like I was just going to be told I had schizophrenia. Um,
Hmm.
it was really validating. Like I was surprised that like it's so common. Like I'd post it online, which was terrifying in the beginning that like I have a fear of schizophrenia, but then I'd have like some of them is like hundreds of comments of people being like me too, and I was like, oh my goodness, like that's actually crazy.
Yeah. It's so true because I had that same fear in college,
Mm.
where like every thought that I have, I would be like, Is that like me or is that another voice? Like, how do I
Mm-hmm.
know it's like I was always back and forth, and
Yeah,
um,
that
I feel like
extreme
that
doubt,
also,
right?
yeah, but I feel like a lot of that stems from like health anxiety too, because it comes down to like, am I like, am I okay? Am I losing control?
Also,
I mean,
like, sorry, just what like to touch on what you were saying before is underestimating your coping abilities with it. A lot of times when I'd go to therapy and I'd bring up these things, I'd be like, well, I'm afraid to be bipolar. I'm afraid of this. And my therapist would say to me, she'd be like, there's a lot of people that are bipolar you wouldn't even know. Like, you're thinking worst case, you're thinking people that don't take care of their mental health because there's
mhm,
actually people in my life that have schizophrenia that they take care of themselves really well. And you wouldn't be able to tell. Um, but when you're thinking of it, when you're thinking, I'm afraid of having this, you're thinking worst case scenario, I wouldn't be able to handle
mhm,
it. And then, the core fear there is my life would be over.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is so true. And also too, to your point, I know we spoke a little bit earlier about ADHD and OCD, and I empathize with you because I have both of those as well. Sometimes that can mask us as being bipolar too. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of people that I know with both of those together, and they've been
Hmm.
misdiagnosed with bipolar. It's almost
Yeah.
like the same story. It's actually pretty
But
wild.
the whole point is that like even if you did have that diagnosis, you can handle it. And it's like
Yes.
that core belief of health anxiety is that everything would be over, I wouldn't be able to do anything. And it's
Right.
like there's so
Right.
many people out there that are taking care of it. Even with
Mhm.
like I used to have a major fear of going blind, and it's like because that core fear was my life would be over, I would be miserable. And then my dad said to me once, he's like, would you rather be this depressed as you are and be able to see your whole life, or would you rather be blind and happy? And my response back then, because I was so deep in it, was I'd rather be miserable but be able to see. But then I started following, I don't remember his name right now, but he's really funny. This he's blind, and he's has
Mhm.
like an influencer account, and he's really happy. And so I
Yeah.
think that almost rewired my brain, like, oh, like your life wouldn't be over. So then my fear kind of dissipated with that a little bit, seeing how his life wasn't over.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of
And
anxiety is thinking black and white, right?
right. And also too the power of social media and being
Mm.
able to challenge these beliefs, see other people, and also uh, put out things through your experience, information, these
Yeah.
conversations themselves. I mean, tell me about starting the anxiety community and like how that picked up for you and what it is that like keeps you doing exactly
Yeah.
that.
So I don't know if you can relate with your ADHD if you ever start
Mhm.
a project and then you can't
Yeah.
finish a project. That was
Oh
major for
yeah.
me. So I actually started that anxiety community like I think in like 2018, but I would post on it
Wow.
like once a month. I wouldn't really do anything consistent with it. And then yeah, so I left it for a while. So it only started like I think I got like 10,000 followers in the last like 2 months or something like that because I started finally posting consistently. And
Hmm.
for me, it feels like the first thing I've actually followed through on. So the journey, I'm not sure how I keep doing it because the whole ADHD thing. But
Hmm.
now that it's aligning with what I want to go to school for, I don't know. It's just really fulfilling being able to help people.
Yeah, it is. I love that you
Yeah.
said that. I
But
think
how I'm staying
people,
consistent, I don't know because ADHD is like a whole other conversation, right?
Yeah. I also too, I think there's a deeper connection there. Like there's a why for you. And you just said it, whether you realize it or not. You like
Yeah.
helping people, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, I feel like my
And
life was almost taken away from me. And actually, I could talk about this. So I used to be a dental
yeah.
assistant. I loved it, which is why I wanted to go to, I quit so that I could go to nursing school. And then last minute, like literally the month I was applying to school, I was like, I'm going to be a psychotherapist. So I changed it up last
Wow.
minute. But when I was a dental assistant, I loved it. But the thing that I loved the most is that I would have patients. So I would assist on a lot of surgical procedures and they'd
Mhm.
be anxious or they'd be crying and I'd be talking to them about it. And even just randomly, I had one daughter that was in and her mom was in the corner of the room and her mom was talking about how like her daughter was like 14 or something. She was struggling so much. And I actually recommended a therapist to her. And then I didn't think much of it sharing my experience in that room because it was just a quick conversation for me. But a year later, she stopped me in the hallway and she was just like, thank you so much for doing that. Like that changed my daughter's life basically. And so I just found it really rewarding meeting new people all the time. And I found that I was enjoying helping them with their anxiety more than I was enjoying the dental assisting. And I was like, maybe I should go to school for this, right? Like everything
Mhm.
was bringing me back to maybe you should just become a psychotherapist.
Wow. So
Yeah.
specifically in psychotherapy, are you looking to specialize in OCD? Or are you looking to do kind of like a
I
broad
think so.
spectrum?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably like I broad as well because there's a lot of other things that interest me, but I do want to specialize in OCD for sure. I think that's
And
a space where we definitely need more people.
we absolutely do. And
Hmm.
I think OCD special like OCD is the field where the providers have most lived experience, I think, because it's so
Yeah.
heavy and so
Mm.
misunderstood. So many people are changed once they go through it
Yeah.
to actually help people.
Yeah. I agree
So
with that.
that's
There
that's
was one thing I
incredible.
wanted. Sorry, I'm interrupting you so much.
No, 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 you're good.
There
I
was
have
one
you
thing you
here to
mentioned.
talk to you.
That's true. That's true. It's just the first time I've ever been personally interviewed, so I just don't want to
That's
be like
so cool.
rude.
No, you're great.
Um, you were saying that a lot of people with ADHD or bipolar, so often there's those comorbidities, I think that's what it's called, where they get
Mhm.
misdiagnosed as each other. I
Yes.
had a fear, and this contributed to my fears of other mental illnesses. Because I was going through so much, and I remember I said that I was feeling suicidal, but I was afraid of dying with my health anxiety. I was
Mhm.
feeling so much. I was so emotional back then, and I would have so many mood swings that I was actually in the process of them testing me if I had borderline personality disorder. And I didn't. It was just OCD. But back then, like I was so emotional just because of everything going on, right? So there's so many
Mhm.
things that can mask each other.
Yeah, and also the fact that like you're young and confused about what's going on. I mean, that's scary.
Yeah.
It's scary to be any age and be confused about what's going on in here,
Hmm.
right? Never mind being someone who doesn't have a full grip on uh their emotional,
Or
structure yet.
anything. Yeah.
Any at all. Yeah. So like I think that's totally valid. And I think if I was in your position like going through that of like I didn't have to go through that specifically. I got diagnosed a different way, but um having to go through that and being terrified of what's on the other side. I mean,
Mm.
that's heavy stuff. So extremely validating. And also
Yeah.
too, when you talk about how the ADHD and the OCD together, um, do you find that with both, it's kind of like a back and forth thing? Or do you feel like you have more of a grip on different aspects of it? Like, tell me about living your life with both of them.
Um, I knew since I was a kid that I had ADHD. It's
Mhm.
not something that I really struggle with that much, but saying that having ADHD and then struggling with another mental illness can amplify that mental illness a lot. When I was going through it, I couldn't do so I'm an honors student, but when I was in high school, I started like getting like even 13% on tests some days because I
Mhm.
couldn't focus at all. So, where my
Right.
ADHD was kind of fine before, it was completely not fine when I was having my anxiety and vice versa.
Right. Totally understand that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, so it sounds like, they have both played a role throughout your life. And
Yeah.
now, where you are now, like studying these things and being able to
Hmm.
help people both online and, of course, I'm assuming you'd want to like start your own practice or something after you graduate, or
Definitely. Yeah. See, the thing is, when I was a kid, and this goes in again to my fear of mental illnesses, I had a lot of people in my life, a lot of like childhood trauma where people did not take care of their mental health conditions at all. There's a lot of people that were
Mhm.
manic, bipolar around me. And so I remember talking to my dad about it, and he was like, well, you notice that so much more because the people who have those conditions and take care of them, you just don't know. They don't talk about it. And so then when I was getting better from my anxiety, I was like, well, I'm going to talk about it because I want people to know that it can be okay if you have that stuff. But back then, when nobody was really like talking about it, all you saw was the
Yeah.
bad stuff. And of
Right.
course, there's bad stuff. Like I've been through struggle, but like I want people to know that like it's not taking away from my life anymore.
Exactly. I think that's very important to showcase because a lot of people, I mean, we've heard it before that OCD is a chronic condition, and like,
Hmm.
and we talk about, yeah, at least I talk about the fact that like I've had it throughout my life. It's taken pretty much
Hmm.
90% of the subtypes, but to talk about it from a place where you understand it, you cope with it. It's not, it's, I think people also might get confused about, oh, well, if it's chronic, like I'm going to spend the rest of my life suffering. And I just don't think that's the case. I think
I agree.
knowing how to understanding it and knowing how to deal with it can put the fire out a little bit better than
Hmm.
when you're like younger, you don't know what's going on and you're just spiraling 24/7.
I agree with that. A couple months ago, and I won't say any names because she's really
Hmm.
big in the mental health community, but I reached out, and she's actually a psychologist. And I was like, do you want to be on my podcast? I see that you have OCD. We could talk about it a little bit. And she goes, well, I don't have OCD anymore. And I was like, in my head, I was like, that's and like, I don't really think you can cure it. And I didn't really
Hmm.
want that apart, whether you can or can't. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. But I didn't
Hmm.
want that on my podcast just because like you said, I want people to know that you can still have OCD, you can still have almost like relapses with them, and just not struggle as much as you used to, right? Because there's always going to be things day and day. There's always going to be intrusive thoughts that I have or
Hmm.
urges to do compulsions, but I'm not struggling like I was. Like I'm not
Yeah.
depressed like I was, right?
Yeah. Or they don't have as much control over you as they
Mhm.
once
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Um, and that's something too, is I don't know if it's the same for you, but personally, I don't really know another way of like think like the way I am. I feel like OCD is very present in everything in my entire life, and
Hmm.
it always has been. And
I agree.
so, like, I think that like my brain is just hardwired like this, and so I think instead of trying to get rid of it, and I sometimes like I had a pretty heavy month of June, like family wise, like my dad was in the
Hmm.
hospital and I was having the worst intrusive thoughts that I've had in years. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, like, you know what this is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you deal with it daily, but not like this. And I think, because I have these conversations with people like yourself and because there's such a strong community of people who understand it, I think that it was easier for me. It took me a couple weeks to kind of crawl out of that, but it
Yeah.
it took me way it was much smoother than it would have been if it was like 5 years ago.
I agree. Like for me,
you know
5 years ago, I wouldn't be leaving my house. It would be debilitating. And now it's like, this sucks, but everybody has
Mhm.
something. And I know the
Yeah.
tools that I have. And if I work with myself and not blame myself for this happening, give myself some compassion, I can work through this and
Yeah.
not have it be. It's almost like preventative work with your OCD now, where before it's like, you've never even been through a thought loop without, I don't know what I'm trying to say.
No, I know exactly what you're
Like especially
saying.
with my health anxiety, like I would never have been through a thought loop where I understood that it was my OCD making me afraid instead of
Hmm.
something actually happening. And now when something happens, I'm like, I feel like crap, but I
Hmm.
can give myself some compassion. I can just sit with it. I don't have to react to it. It's almost like noise.
Yeah. And it's also too, if you can like almost personify it, like
Mm.
um I call my OCD and like my brain like Barney. Like
Yeah.
like if you ever watched the Flintstones. When I was a kid, I used to watch like the Flintstones with my dad, and Barney was always just like the small loud one, and I was like, that's my OCD. Like
Yeah.
he's a caveman. He wants to be heard, and he's always there
Yeah.
trying to like tell me what's up. And it's like, all
Honestly,
right,
just
Barney.
making it separate from yourself. Like it's
Yeah,
not you.
yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I really do love that. So, and I'm glad that you're able to talk about it openly, especially,
Hmm.
on social media, because to be honest with you, social media has been such a positive force with,
Yeah.
especially for my OCD, and
You got to
and
know how to
everybody,
use it though.
100%, one with
Because when I
responsibility.
first started, I was only Googling things for the reassurance compulsion, and I would just find
Right.
myself in feeling worse in rabbit holes. Like I'd just Google everything. I'd Google, am I schizophrenic? And then I'd
Yep.
be finding out that eating too much sugar causes schizophrenia. And the next thing you know, like I'm not eating any sugar.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
Google, you have to be very careful with Google. And that
Yeah.
now, because social media, you can search pretty much anything.
Mm.
You do have to be careful with that. I think for me, I'm saying from the sense of like seeing other people talk about
Yeah.
it.
That part is amazing.
Yeah.
But having the
Like,
self discipline to like go on the good stuff instead of the bad stuff, that was definitely a struggle for me.
yeah, which
Yeah.
is understandable, right? Because I
Mhm.
mean, it's at your fingertips, literally. Like
It's true.
you know what I mean? So it takes a lot of self-discipline, and I think most of us have a lot to learn when it comes to self-discipline sometimes.
Yes, I
So,
agree.
talk a little bit about you. You mentioned POCD as well, and I don't think I've dove too much into this with other people on my
Mm.
podcast. And I don't know, I didn't necessarily have that subtype. So,
Yeah.
like, I've had plenty of subtypes, but that's one of them that I did not have, and I'm just wondering, like, what your experience with that
Yeah,
was.
I mean, the thing is with OCD themes is they're even though they all feel so drastically different from the last one you experienced, they're all the same. All the
Hmm.
patterns behind them are the same, and that's the part that doing the CBT and pointing out how the patterns worked, it made me have less belief in the fears that were
Hmm.
or whatever I was focusing on the time because I understood how it worked. And so with the pedophilia OCD, it wasn't really anything different from the other themes. It's just extreme doubt. It's you being afraid of something. And
Hmm.
then you question, am I like that thing? And then with the
Hmm.
OCD, you start coming up with something in your head. You start ruminating. You start going, well, I did this. I did that. Did I feel this? And then you start questioning yourself to the point where you doubt who you are as a person, and then you convince yourself that you're a pedophile. And at the end of the
Hmm.
day, like, why are you doing that? Because you're so terrified of what a pedophile is
Hmm.
that you're convincing yourself that you are one. So it's so much the opposite of you,
Yeah.
but you're still convincing yourself that it's you. So, like, I would almost avoid being around kids because I was
Hmm.
like, are you this? Even though
Yeah.
I'm not. But again, OCD is just extreme doubt. So it's like, whatever. I get messages all the time like, can OCD be this? Can OCD be that? OCD can be anything. It's just that extreme doubt. It's that obsession. It's the compulsion with it that you're trying to have the temporary relief of that feeling. And then, you
Right.
spiral, you spiral, you spiral, you go deeper and deeper. And then all of a sudden, like you're sitting in your living room, like, can I even be around a kid right now? And it's like if you
Yep.
took a step back and looked at you, you'd be like, of course you're not a pedophile. But when
Hmm.
you're thinking about it that much, it's so easy to convince yourself of quite literally anything.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that you brought that up about how they all really had the same thinking patterns,
Yeah.
and because that reminds me of like I had a lot of moral, OCD where am I a bad person? Where I'd literally
Hmm.
go through and look at every like bad thing I've done and try to like reverse it in my head.
Yeah.
And it's like it's almost the same thing. It's like, am I a bad person? Like, oh, but you did this, this, and
Yeah.
this,
You
or
try to come up
so
with
it's the
proof.
same thing. Right, right. You try to come up with proof to avoid the thought of being a bad person, to prove
Yeah.
to yourself that you're not.
And even if there's no
Um,
proof, you're twisting scenarios and memories to try and make their proof because you're so afraid. You're like, let's get ahead of this so we can deal with this.
right. Yeah. It's just one of it's and I know you know this. Like I don't have to tell
Yeah.
you, but the people listening who don't have it, I mean, it is extremely scary. So I think
How do you
if
open up
for
about
someone who doesn't
pedophilia
understand
OCD
it,
when some people, they barely know what the word anxiety is? They're like, why are you
right,
worried about that? And I don't blame them
right,
for thinking that. They just don't understand. But it's like, you can't open up about something like that when they don't understand. They're going to be
and
afraid of you.
also that you brought up intake forms, right? Where it's like they have these
Mm,
questions of like, have you ever thought of this? And it's like
yeah.
with OCD, like you're not thinking of these things like writing in your diary, like, oh, I can't wait to, stab my leg
No,
tonight.
you
Like
don't want it. You're afraid of
it's
it.
right, exactly. And I think that it comes down to the idea of society still not understanding these things, because I feel like we're just now starting to open up about it within the last 10 years, if
Yeah.
to this degree, especially with social media. So it's I know that you're doing the work out there
Well,
and
people want to
learning
know that
about it,
it's okay to open up. And when they listen to a podcast like this, then they'll go, okay, so I have had these thoughts too. I just never said anything before. So it
right,
really
yeah,
starts
and
with these
this
platforms.
exactly. And you talked about your podcast as well. What is your podcast the same name, the Anxiety Community,
Yeah,
or is it
it is.
different?
I just post on it so infrequently, but it's in the link in my Instagram bio. But it's not
Cool. Okay,
exclusively
so
OCD.
mhm,
It's kind of everything. So I interviewed like a child psychologist one time on just like parenting.
mhm.
One time on a lady who has bipolar, so she could explain that. So it's not just OCD, but it's just kind of everything. Things that like
I
I
think that's
couldn't
great
explain
too.
myself, I wanted on there.
Right. And if you think about it too, like anxiety is like this tree, and there's so
Hmm.
many branches that kind of branch off of it. So I feel like it's good to be able to dive into those things, because there's so much understanding that people need to go through,
Hmm.
regardless if they have OCD or not, with their own journey.
Yeah.
So that's really good. And I love the work that you're doing. The work
Thank
that I've
you.
seen on social media that you're doing, I think, is incredible. And I think that people can learn a lot from your page, and also just connecting with you. I think that's why this community is so strong, is because everybody just kind of wants to connect with each other, and we're like,
I
hey,
love
like,
that. Yeah.
like, what my brain's like, because you've lived it
Yeah.
to a certain degree, and like we understand each other, that like the rest of the world who doesn't have
That's
OCD,
the amazing
you
part of
know
technology. That's like the good part of
yeah,
using it. Um,
it is. I agree.
have you ever had it where you've kind of like created symptoms? Like I know you mentioned you have like a little bit of health anxiety. To kind
Well,
of
I
like
have, I have big health
okay,
anxiety.
big health
Yeah.
anxiety, where you kind of like create a symptom to fit into a condition.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my
Yep.
most popular example. So when I was afraid of having schizophrenia, the knowledge that I had of schizophrenia was my worst enemy, because all of a sudden, any symptom that I knew, I started mimicking it. So I went to one of my doctors who I've been seeing since I was like a little baby. So she wasn't like a medical doctor, but she's like a homeopathic doctor. And
Hmm.
that was a big mistake, because she ended up telling me that I didn't even have anxiety in the first place. And I was like, well, hold on. I actually have like 6 different diagnoses by this point. So anyway, so I was in
Wow.
the room with her, and she was like, no, you don't have schizophrenia, because I have a patient who has schizophrenia and they believe that they're the Queen of England. And I was like, okay, okay. I get home, and then all of a sudden, my symptoms are in my head. There's a little voice in my head. It was like, you're the Queen of England. You're the Queen of England. Do you believe that you're the Queen of England? If you believe you're the Queen of England, then that means you have schizophrenia. And like, it's so obvious looking back at it now. But back then, I was like, oh my God. Like, I was terrified.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, I couldn't fall asleep without the TV, because I was like, I'm going to start hearing voices. I'm going to be just like that person. So I think it's just so crazy how you can even like mimic symptoms to that extent. Like you can convince yourself of anything. It's like when you go into the woods and someone's like, there's a bear out there, and you're like looking for that bear, anything becomes a bear all
Mhm.
of a sudden. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Or when somebody's like, hey, don't think of a pink elephant,
Yeah,
and like the
no,
first
it's
thing you
quite
do.
literally that. So she was like, I had a patient that believes you're the Queen of England. So now the next couple of weeks, I'm convincing myself that I believe I'm the Queen of England. When if you asked me, do you believe you're the Queen? No, I don't believe that. But am I
Right.
afraid that I believe that? Yeah.
Hmm. No, I 1000% know what you're talking
Yeah.
about. And I once saw something that got me down that health anxiety road where I was like,
Mm.
what if I become afraid to eat? And then I was like, every time I would sit down to eat, I'd be like, am I afraid to eat?
Mm-hmm.
Are you having like, do you have a stomach ache? Do you have like a rapid heart rate? And like, I would give myself those symptoms, and to the point where I would have a panic attack before eating. And I'd be like, oh my God,
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid of eating, but I was really afraid
Mm-hmm.
of
Mine was
eating,
like that, but I would have allergy symptoms. I would have it where I was
Mm,
afraid to eat. And if I didn't have these anxiety symptoms that were mimicking allergy symptoms, I would have kept eating. It would have been fine. But every time I ate, my throat felt like it was completely like choking. My face would actually flush completely red. And then I'd feel like my tongue was swelling, and none of it was happening. It was like, well, it like kind of was, but it was an anxiety reaction. And I just think that's insane
mm,
because when I'm not worried about having an allergic reaction, I don't have that.
mhm. It's the power of really
Yeah.
that almost like self-suggestion,
Well, it's
you
dumb. I
know.
think that's awful.
It's really hard. It's hard for people like us. And I think, you know, when one of my friends, Sean, he has the
Mhm.
page ERP and me, and he does like lives of him doing his exposures, like on, because he has agoraphobia. He's on the highway driving, and he's just observing. He's observing what's going on, you know, as part of his exposure, where it's like, okay, throat's closing up, you know, like, I'm afraid that this is going to happen.
Mhm.
I'm just going to keep driving, you know what I mean? And it's it's taught me so much about, you know, ERP in general, because
Mhm.
it's not so much about, it's not about seeking that comfort. It's not about denying the fact that you might
And it's
believe
not about getting rid of the
you're the
thoughts
Queen of
either.
England. Right, it's about dealing with
Mhm.
the discomfort,
Yeah,
right?
almost like
And
observing them and being like, "Okay, that intrusive thought is just a regular thought." Like I'm making
right,
it an intrusive thought by reacting to it.
right,
Mhm.
exactly, and that's the knowledge I didn't know of growing up. Like, I'm 10 years old,
Mhm.
11 years old. I wish that I knew these things. I didn't know them until my mid to late 20s, and I've
Yeah.
just turned 30.
Yeah.
So, like, these are things that people, I think, if they have OCD and they're listening to this for the first time, or they think they might have OCD, just being able to know that you're not alone, and this is something that we are talking about. There's a
Mhm.
lot of people who deal with this, and
And your
this
life's not
is
over. It's
not,
very treatable.
yes, extremely treatable. And I'm on medication. I've been on it for 10 years, and
Yeah, I'm on a
honestly,
Citraline.
okay, yeah,
Mhm.
I never was put on that. I was on Paxil and
Mm.
venlafaxine. So I know it's the same kind of family, but if I didn't have my medication, I probably would have gone much deeper than I went.
Yeah.
And I know it's different for
Yeah, I've
everybody.
done
I
it both
just,
ways.
okay, so yeah, so you understand.
Yeah.
Um, you know, when you can't leave your house, when you can't function, there needs to be some sort of intervention there
Yes.
to be
One
able
of my
to do
OCD
that.
things is that I was afraid of taking medication because I was afraid of the side
Mhm.
effects. And I thought, I Googled one time that like a side effect was schizophrenia. So I didn't take medication for like 6 or 7 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So
my OCD
you,
did end up getting better. Like, I mean, like the way I
mhm,
managed it ended up getting better. But it wasn't until I had like one relapse that I was like, I'm not doing this again. Like, I was just so scared of it going back to the way it was.
yeah,
I was like, I'm just going to try the medication. Like, I don't care.
yeah,
Yeah.
I totally understand that.
Yeah.
So, I, uh, I think that if there's one you know, one thing that people take away from this is
Mm.
the fact that, like, one, you don't have to suffer in silence, because we
Mm.
are literally talking about this daily on either social media or in platforms like this. And two, there's a reason why the OCD community is strong and connected. Is because we
Because it's one of the
understand,
top 10 debilitating disorders of like not just
right?
mental health, but physical health as well.
Right, exactly. And
Hmm.
so it's important to be able to have an outlet to open up
Yeah.
to, and to get the right help from the right resources, because it is scary going to someone who's not a
Yeah.
specialist and saying, "Hey, I have these thoughts," right?
Yeah.
So um, it is. if there's something that you could say or leave behind here on the episode, is there anything that you'd want to say?
If there's one takeaway from this, if you are thinking about getting help for OCD, go to an OCD specialist. Seek out one and don't be afraid to ask them questions about what even makes them qualified to do that. Did they just add that on because they specialize broadly in a bunch of things, or did they have lived experience? Because it's so important, because therapy can actually be harmful to you, like talk therapy if you have OCD, because it's just going to be contributing to your thought patterns and your fear by talking about it over and over and over again. And going to an OCD specialist that actually understands and provides a space for you to be able to hit them with any intrusive thought that you have without them being reactive to it, because that's another fear. Like, am I going to say something? And they're going to be like, It's just
Mm-hmm.
so important because they'll create a better space for you to get better. And
I
like
love
you
that.
said, the OCD community is so intertwined because it's such a debilitating disorder. It can be, but it's also one of the most treatable ones. So I think all of us that have been through it and been through all of these themes, first of all, there's nothing that you could throw at us that we'd be surprised about. And second of
Mm-hmm.
all, I think we all just know how good life can be when you're taking care of your mental health and you learn how it works and help yourself. So I think there's a lot of hope out there. And if you told me when I was first going through this that it could get better, I'd be like, no, it can't. Like, it absolutely can't get better. I wouldn't believe you at all. But like, it does. And nothing lasts
Mm-hmm.
forever. Um, Going through bad things, it's just a moment in your entire life. It won't be your entire life if you work hard at it.
Yeah, I do love that. And it's so interesting because I was just flashbacking to um, a point in 2018 for myself where I was having an intense episode of existential OCD.
Oh, yeah, we
So, and
didn't
I
even
remember
touch on
thinking
that.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, I remember thinking like, will I feel any better like a year from now?
Mhm.
Like that was a thought in my head because I was like, there's no way I'll
Yeah,
get
and
past
then
this
you
because I
start
can't.
monitoring the progress of your OCD instead of just living. Like, instead of focusing on how can I live, you're like, how can I get rid of it? How can I stop having intrusive
Right.
thoughts? And it's just,
And you can't really.
yeah.
You can't get rid of it. It's about dealing with that
But they
uncertainty
don't have to
with,
hurt you
obviously with a
anymore.
professional. Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think that's the part where we can get to, and
Hmm.
for people to understand that just because it is something that is chronic, it doesn't have to be to the point where you're not living your life,
Hmm.
to the extent that you would like to live your life.
Yeah.
So, did you have any existential OCD or
Yeah.
anything like that? You did, yeah.
Just like, it breaks my brain. Sometimes I get a lot of anxiety about like why we're here, what it goes a lot with
Yeah.
the fear of dying for me. And when
Hmm.
I first started dissociating, I would have it a lot because I didn't even understand what
Dissociating.
dissociating was. I was like floating. And then it was when that, like, I don't smoke weed, but it was almost like
Hmm.
it was almost like I was high. So, like, I guess I don't really know
Yeah.
what that would be like, but I don't know.
Well, I have smoked weed
Yeah.
before, and I have desensitized or
Mhm.
disassociated plenty of times, and
Yeah.
it's pretty similar. Where
Mhm.
you feel like there's like almost like a gloss over your eyes, and the outside
Yeah.
world is not real,
Yeah.
or you're not real.
Yeah. If you
You
talk
know?
to me, it's like, am I even having this conversation right now? And then
Right,
I feel like
right.
existential OCD kind of goes into every single theme, because then I'll
Yeah.
go into theme of, am I crazy?
Hmm.
It just leads to
Hmm.
every single one for me.
And also, it's the lack of control
Mm,
of, if I am crazy, like I have no control over this, I'm
mm,
going to lose it. um and the existentialism of like there are no answers for you
yep.
unless you have some sort of spiritual experience and you get the answers all of a sudden.
I
uh
don't know. People
I,
talk about
I,
doing those what's it called? Those tanks. Have you heard of those?
no.
It's like these tanks that you go in and you like float and they're completely silent. And people go in them for like an hour at a time sometimes. Then they end up like crying, having like completely life changing experiences. And that sounds terrifying to me because like being alone with my OCD for that, you'll never find me doing one of those. Like, you won't. I just feel
Yeah,
like that
well,
would
that
be an
sounds a little.
existential OCD nightmare.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit
Well,
out of
it's
our pay grade
completely
here.
dark and you're floating in this tank and it's like designed like a lot of people have like mental breakdowns for like the first time in their life when they go in it.
Oh my god! So we'd be
Look it
pros
up
at that
after. I
point.
think it's called
Yeah.
self-deprivation tank or a self, or maybe it's not called that,
Okay.
but it's you'll find it if you Google it.
I'm interested actually.
You should.
I will absolutely look that up. It's funny because it sounds like you don't need a tank to have a breakdown and have like an existential
No,
kind
yeah.
of thought
Yeah.
process, and neither do I.
Mm.
But that could be an exposure. You know what I mean? If that's high up on your exposure list, that could be a way to
There's
work
some people
yourself
that
up,
can't
and
even last like 5 minutes in it.
that's
I
insane.
have that though. I can't fall
That's
asleep without the TV because I'm like, I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now. Sometimes I sleep with the lights on too.
really.
I just don't want to be alone with myself sometimes. Just the thoughts that
Yeah, no,
happen.
I can understand that.
Hmm.
I think I tried my best to like explain to people who don't have OCD like what it really is, and I really feel like it really comes down to the relationship to the nature of how your brain
Mm.
works,
Hmm.
which can be that way for most disorders, right? Or differences, but I think like because our brains work to like the 10th degree of like thinking about everything, and
Yeah.
then the reactions that we have to them keep us in that cycle. I think that there's because everybody or like most people can overthink, right? I think that it's
Yes.
a human natural thing, but it's what you do with that overthinking and how you react to it,
Yeah, that's the
and how your
OCD
body
part for
reacts to
sure.
it. So, yeah, no tanks for us. I
Nope.
think we'll pass on that.
Yeah.
But um, I thank you so much. I mean, thanks for giving your time here
Yeah.
and sharing your story and like what you're doing with the page. I mean, I think it's incredible. Like I said, I think people can learn a lot from your page, and just being able to connect with you, like you know, having you on the show and chatting about it. It's been really really cool. So I appreciate you for coming on here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thank you for whoever's listened to this point. I know sometimes it's easy to trail
Yeah.
off with a podcast, but
Yeah, you know what? If they have a long drive, this is
yeah.
great.
If you want to find me, just that anxiety community on Instagram. But if you go through the link in my bio on that anxiety community, you'll find everything.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, you heard her. Go there
Yeah.
and check it out.